There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And then Jesus asks His disciples the second question, and He says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter's hand shot up without hesitation. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, this is a question that every person is going to have to answer for themselves. And all of us, we will be judged by how we answer this question. And it's not so much by what we say, but it's more by how we live. And Jesus here, He makes quite a big deal over what Peter's answer is. And you kind of wonder, well, why is this such a big deal? Because Peter, he's already been with Jesus for about 3 years. Peter, he's already called Jesus Lord. He's also called Him the Holy One of God. And we've heard other people around Him confessing that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah. But you see here, Peter's not only confessing that Jesus is the Christ, but he's confessing that Jesus is God. He's confessing that He is deity, the Son of the living God. And Peter's confession here, it's not coming after Jesus has done some great kind of miracle. So it's not coming out of Peter's feelings or out of his emotions. This is coming out of his heart. This is what Peter believes. And not everybody knows this at that time, that Jesus is deity, that He is the actual Son of the living God. And Peter here, he doesn't just think it. Peter, he knows it. And the reason that he knows it is because God revealed it to him. But if you notice, God hid this knowledge from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Jesus, He tells Peter, He says that God, Jesus' Father, that He revealed it to him. And so now this next part of Peter's confession, it's looked on very differently by all the different Christian denominations. And some people will try to tell you that Peter, that he is the rock that Jesus will build His church on. They'll say that Peter, well, he's the first pope. And you'll get that picture of old St. Pete with his ring of keys, like a janitor with a huge ring of keys, sitting behind a desk at the pearly gates. But I don't think that's what Jesus is describing here in the building of His church. I don't believe that Peter himself is that rock. Because the first thing that Jesus says to Peter is, "You are Peter." And we do know that that name Peter means rock. And so Peter's name is basically like Rocky, or maybe like Rock Hudson. But the Greek word for Peter that Jesus uses here is the word Petros, which actually means a small little stone. It's like the kind of stone that you would shoot out of a slingshot. It's not a big rock. And the word Jesus uses next is a big rock, because the next thing Jesus says is, "And on this rock, I will build my church." So the word that Jesus uses here for rock is not Petros, like the name of Peter. It's the word Petra, which means a large, unmovable rock, like a mountain made of stone. And so what Jesus is saying here, He says, "You are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church." And so this word Petra in Greek is used for things like Mount Olympus or the Caucasus Mountains. It's not a little movable stone like the name Peter. So if the rock is not Peter, then what is the Petra? What is this rock? What's this large rock that Jesus is going to build His church on? Well, what I believe is that that rock is the confession of Peter, Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. The confession of who Jesus is, that's the big rock that was revealed to Peter by the Father, that Jesus is God's own Son. That's the rock. Jesus is God. That's the rock that Jesus will build his church on. Okay, so now we hear the first mention of the word church in the Bible. And this is the Greek word ekklesia. And ekklesia wasn't really a religious word. It just means group. It means a called out group. And this is the same word that we use for the local assembly, the local church. But here, Jesus is calling this called out group my group because he owns the group, my ekklesia. And Jesus says, I will build. He doesn't say we will build. So Jesus is the builder of his group. And Jesus says, my church. He doesn't say it's our church. And so Jesus is saying he's putting together his group and he's calling it my church. And our translation here, it's pretty good because it says the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it, where some translations will say the gates of hell. But it really should be Hades because Jesus is talking about death and the grave. And that's what Hades was. Hades was the holding place for the dead. It was the word for the grave. And Jesus, he isn't really speaking about hell because hell is the final place of eternal damnation. And here, Jesus is just talking about the grave and death. And even though it does mean that no powers of evil or darkness will ever have power over the church, Jesus is also saying that the church will not be shut in the gates of death, that death can't hold us, that Jesus has this power over the grave. And gates in the ancient world, they were to keep enemies out or to keep the people inside secure, so that the gates of death, they can't keep us from life for those who belong to Jesus's group, the church. So Hades was kind of like a type of prison, but it's a prison where Jesus, he holds the keys. And keys always represent authority. So it's Jesus, he has the power over death and the grave. And we know that at Jesus' resurrection, that he released imprisoned people that were imprisoned in Hades, in that part of Hades that was called paradise. And so now he explains that about hell, but then he tells Peter that he's giving Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And here again, this isn't Jesus saying to Peter, pictured sitting at the pearly gates, go ahead, Pete, go ahead and let in anybody you want. Jesus isn't giving Peter that authority. That authority belongs to Jesus alone. But what Jesus is giving Peter in these keys, he's given Peter the authority to lead others in a like faith like Peter's. And we see this acted out in the book of Acts, that Peter, he was the one at Pentecost who opened up the doors to the kingdom of heaven to the Jews in saving faith when he had that sermon at Pentecost. And again, Peter, he opened up the doors of heaven again to the Samaritans when he preached to the Samaritans. And then he did it again. He opened up the doors to heaven to the Gentiles when he preached to them. And then Jesus, he goes on and he talks about binding and loosing. And these were terms that were already familiar to the Jews because that's what the rabbis would do. They would be able to bind or loose somebody in a particular point of the law. But the rabbis, they could only bind or loose only according to what the law said, which means that the rabbis, they had the power to declare something forbidden because of the law, or to declare something allowed because of the law. And that's the same kind of authority that Jesus is giving Peter here, the ability to bind, but it's only to bind what's already been bound by God in heaven, or to loose, which has already been allowed, whatever God has already allowed to be loosed in heaven. So this is not saying that God is obligated to perform whatever Peter binds, or what Peter wants to be done in any situation that, well, now you'll have to do it. Now Peter will be calling the shots. It's going to have to be God's will for whatever Peter binds. And so this is saying that Peter's authorized to do the things that God has already willed. And we see this also carried out after Jesus' resurrection, when Peter's filled with the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And we can see an example of this when God had declared all foods clean to Peter in a vision, where God told Peter that what God has cleansed, do not call unclean. And that didn't just pertain to the foods. It also pertained to the Gentiles, because God had made the Gentiles clean. And Peter is the one who actually proclaimed their acceptability to God, to the rest of the Jewish church, because at that time, the whole church was Jewish, and they didn't know that Gentiles could be saved. So right there, Peter is loosing what God had already loosed in heaven. But there is a special authority that was only given to the apostles, that only the apostles had. Okay, so now Jesus, he's made this great statement over Peter's future. And we see that God has plans to use him. And we heard Peter's great confession of faith of Jesus being the Christ, the Son of God. And so there's no doubt among the disciples that Jesus is now claiming to be the Christ and to be God's Son. And then what Jesus does is he commands them not to tell anybody that Jesus is the Christ. Because Jesus, he's not willing to reveal it to the world yet. He's not going to reveal it publicly. And so now Jesus, he starts to explain to his disciples what he actually came into the world to do as the Christ. And Jesus has alluded to this, and he's alluded to his crucifixion to them before, about his suffering and about his death and his burial, but he's never stated it this clearly of what's going to take place. Because Jesus here, he's trying to prepare them, because there's less than a year before this will all come to pass. And now you have Peter here, who's just been affirmed by Jesus of being used by God. And he's been told that he hears from God the Father, and that God the Father, he reveals things to him. And so now Peter, he thinks that he's the one, since he can hear from God, that he has the right to take Jesus aside and actually rebuke Jesus. And Peter says, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall not happen to you." And so Peter, he thinks he has the ability to protect Jesus. But just like Peter wasn't aware when God was speaking through him, Peter's also not aware when he spoke for Satan. So this Peter, who was called a rock, now he's going to be called Satan by Jesus. And he's going from such a high place to such a low place the same day. And Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." So Jesus is telling Peter here that his place is behind him. His place isn't in front of him. Peter, you're not to lead me. You're to be behind me, following me. And that's our place too. Our place is following Jesus and not leading him into the things of our own wills, where we're only mindful of the things of men, of the things that come up in our own personal worlds.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.